"You can't bring this through, old man. Next time, mail your junk." The TSA agent's voice rang sharp over the hum of Southgate International Airport. He held a battered metal box in one gloved hand, inspecting it with theatrical disdain. "Souvenirs don't count as carry-ons," he added, smirking as he flipped it into a gray plastic bin. The box hit the edge, tumbled, and popped open its contents, scattering across the conveyor belt in a metallic cascade. People nearby turned their heads. Inside the box, a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, 2 campaign medals from Vietnam and Desert Storm, and a custom unit badge still etched with sand and sweat from Saigon. They spun and clattered on the belt like loose change pieces of a man's legacy dumped like junkyard scrap. Officer Logan Price Young, and too proud of his badge, snorted and looked up. "This isn't a museum, buddy," he said loud enough for others to hear. A few nervous chuckles bubbled up from behind the screening line. No one moved to help. No one spoke. Tom Reynolds stood silently at the end of the belt, his back ramrod straight despite the ache in his spine. 82 years old, retired Marine Master Sergeant. He wore an old recon cap threadbare at the edges and a pilot's jacket too worn for fashion but too sacred to discard. His left knee trembled slightly from a combat injury that never fully healed. His right hand, scarred and veined, reached down slowly to collect the fallen medals, his breath tight, his pride bruised. He didn't argue, didn't demand anything, just gathered what had been thrown like debris and gently returned them to their case. The lid no longer latched properly. He didn't say a word. What no one knew, not Officer Price, not the passengers watching, not even the other TSA agents laughing behind the scanner, was that Tom wasn't headed to a vacation or retirement cruise. He was flying to Washington, D.C. to speak at a memorial service at Arlington National Cemetery. A final honor for his unit, a chance to represent the men who never came home. He hadn't asked for fanfare, only safe passage. Now he sat alone at Gate 14, the battered metal case sealed with a TSA sticker resting quietly in his lap. Around him, the world moved on. Phones buzzed, announcements echoed. But something had shifted. Not just in the air, but in the silence left behind. What they thought was just an old man with a metal box was about to become a moment no one would forget. The box rested heavy on Tom Reynolds' lap, not in weight, but in meaning. It was taped shut now, with a TSA inspection sticker plastered across the lid like an apology that didn't ask for forgiveness. Around him, the terminal buzzed as if nothing had happened, families boarding agents calling zones, a child crying over lost headphones. But Tom sat motionless at Gate 14, back straight, despite the pain in his hip eyes, fixed on the floor just past his boots. He hadn't said a word since Officer Logan Price dumped his medals onto the conveyor belt like scrap metal. He'd merely gathered them piece by piece and returned them to their case without complaint, like a man collecting something sacred from the dust. Nobody helped. Nobody said a word, except one. Emily Foster had watched it all. As a senior flight attendant, she'd spent years in terminals, brushing past travelers who didn't make eye contact, and TSA lines where dignity was optional. But what she witnessed this morning, what that young officer did to an 82-year-old veteran, had hit something deeper. The way Tom had bent down to retrieve his Bronze Star from the cold tile floor. The way Logan Price had snorted and said, "Not a museum old-timer." Emily hadn't confronted anyone. She just took out her phone, walked calmly into the nearest service corridor, and dialed a number saved under "Only if it matters." It mattered. Brooks came the voice on the second ring. "Secretary Brooks?" Emily said, lowering her voice, "I need to call in that favor you once offered. Southgate International, Terminal B." An elderly Marine Master Sergeant Thomas Reynolds was humiliated by TSA. His medals were dumped on the floor. Nobody's doing anything, but you should see how he's sitting, like he's the one who should apologize. There was no hesitation. Gate the voice asked. 14, 10 minutes. That was all. Emily hung up and returned to her post near the boarding gate, heart pounding. She gave Tom a soft nod as she passed. He didn't look up. 9 minutes later, the terminal grew still. At first, no one noticed, but then the air changed, like the static before a storm. The boarding area quieted. Conversations tapered off. Eyes lifted. Through the main entrance of Terminal B walked Secretary of Defense Natalie Brooks. No press, no cameras, just the solemn energy of someone used to command. She wore no uniform, only a simple black blazer, a Marine Corps pin on the collar. Behind her trailed 3 aides, each carrying black leather cases marked with gold trim. No one stopped them. No one dared. She walked with purpose directly toward the man everyone else had overlooked. When she reached Tom, she didn't speak right away. She simply removed her cap and gave him a salute, not the rehearsed kind used in ceremonies, but the kind offered in reverence, woman to warrior. Tom blinked up at her stunned, unsure if he should stand. "You don't need to rise, Master Sergeant," she said gently. "The country should have stood for you." "I wasn't expecting," he began. "You weren't supposed to," she said. "But we failed, and that ends now." One of her aides stepped forward, opening a sleek, velvet-lined box engraved in brass with the name Thomas Reynolds Valor. The secretary took the TSA taped box from Tom's lap and peeled away the label. She opened it slowly and carefully, revealing the disordered medals inside each one, a testament to service, suffering, and sacrifice. With gloved hands, she transferred them one by one into the new case: the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, 2 Vietnam campaign ribbons, his Saigon-issued unit insignia, even the tarnished Good Conduct Medal from 1964. Each was placed with care, not just for arrangement, but for memory. As she finished, she closed the lid and handed it back to him. Her voice dropped as she leaned close. "My father served under your unit in Da Nang. He spoke of a Sergeant Reynolds who held the line when it fell apart. I think that was you." Tom's eyes welled, but he nodded silently. By now, the terminal had gone completely quiet. Dozens of passengers stood watching. Airport staff, once too busy to notice him, now stood at attention. Someone began filming. Secretary Brooks turned to the crowd. "This man was disrespected by one of our own," she said. "And not because of protest or policy, but because we've forgotten what these medals mean. We've forgotten that when someone carries service like this in a box, it deserves reverence, not ridicule." She paused, letting the silence speak before continuing. "Service doesn't stop when the war ends. It follows you home in your back, your lungs, your memories. It earns you a seat, not pity, just dignity." From the back of the terminal, TSA officer Logan Price emerged, looking sheepish and pale. His name had already been submitted for disciplinary review quietly and immediately, but Natalie Brooks didn't point him out. She didn't need to. Instead, she said just loud enough to carry, "You don't touch what you haven't earned." The crowd parted as a Marine officer stepped forward to escort Tom to his gate. As he passed, people rose, not because they were told, but because something inside them told them to. Hats came off. Hands were placed on hearts. A child saluted clumsily. A janitor whispered, "Thank you." As Tom moved through the crowd, his new case in hand, and his dignity restored, he said nothing. But the silence he left behind spoke volumes, and nothing at Southgate Terminal would ever feel the same again. The clatter of boots on the polished terminal floor still echoed faintly as Secretary of Defense Natalie Brooks stood with quiet authority beside Tom Reynolds, the new velvet-lined case now resting in his lap. Around them, passengers had stopped mid-step, airport staff stood frozen, and even the overhead announcements had fallen silent, almost as if the building itself had paused to listen. But it wasn't over yet. Brooks slowly turned eyes, scanning the stunned faces gathered near the Southgate Terminal C checkpoint. She said nothing for a moment, letting the silence thicken. It wasn't anger that hung in the air. It was something heavier. Expectation. Reflection. Then she spoke, not through a microphone, not shouting, but in a voice that carried because it didn't need to rise. 10 minutes ago, she began, a man who served this country with distinction was reduced to an inconvenience. His medals, symbols of sacrifice, were tossed like trash. Not by a mob, not by some foreign enemy, but by someone wearing a badge of this government. The words hit like thunder. She turned slightly toward the checkpoint where TSA officer Logan Price stood frozen near the conveyor belt, eyes wide, hands twitching at his sides. His earlier smugness had vanished, replaced now by the pale, stunned face of a man who understood, too late, that his actions had consequences. Brooks didn't name him. She didn't have to. Master Sergeant Thomas Reynolds served with honor in Vietnam and again in the Gulf. The decorations in that case, she gestured to the box on Tom's lap, represent wounds taken for strangers, brothers lost in jungles, and decades of quiet pain endured so others wouldn't have to. She faced the crowd again. When you touch those metals, you don't just touch metal. You touch memory. You touch sacrifice. And if you haven't earned the right to carry that weight, you have no business mocking those who have. Passengers stood motionless. Some had begun recording. Others lowered their phones, too ashamed of what they'd just witnessed to hide behind a screen. "You don't touch what you haven't earned," she said again, more quietly this time, but somehow louder in its gravity. Her gaze rested just for a moment on Officer Price. He swallowed hard. The words had pinned him to the floor more effectively than any order ever could. Brooks turned back to Tom, her expression softening as she extended a hand to help him stand. Slowly, with deliberate effort, Tom rose from the bench. The velvet case was now tucked securely under his arm. Around them, no one moved. Then from behind the United Airlines service desk, a single agent clapped once, twice, hesitantly. Another followed, then the flood. Applause rolled through the terminal like a wave building from a few scattered hands into a full crescendo of reverence. People stood taller. Hats were removed. A young boy near the jetway placed a hand over his heart. Tom didn't smile. He simply nodded, once the Marine in him too proud for showmanship, but grateful nonetheless. His face was calm, but his eyes shimmered, touched not by spectacle, but by recognition. A Marine Corps officer stepped forward, offering his arm. "If you'll allow me, Master Sergeant," he said. Tom accepted. As they began walking slowly toward Gate 12, passengers parted like a tide clearing the path, not out of fear, but out of deep, instinctive respect. Officers saluted. Children watched with wide eyes. The pilot for his flight stepped out of the jetway, hat in hand, and waited to shake his hand. "You've got all the time you need, Sergeant," the pilot said quietly. "This flight doesn't leave without you." Secretary Brooks followed at a distance, her staff maintaining a respectful perimeter. But before stepping away from the checkpoint entirely, she turned one last time. Officer Logan Price still hadn't moved. Brooks approached him slowly and with no raised voice. "No threat," she said. "You wore that badge like it gave you authority. What you forgot is that it also gives you responsibility, and responsibility begins with knowing what not to mock." He didn't respond. Couldn't. She stepped past him without another word. By the time Tom Reynolds boarded his flight, every passenger had risen, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Some saluted, some placed hands over hearts. One young Marine recruit, barely 19, whispered, "That's the kind of man I want to be." Tom didn't look back. He didn't need to. The airport didn't just see him now, it remembered him. Back at the checkpoint, silence returned. Officer Price stood alone, but something else lingered in the air, a reckoning. Not loud, not angry, but undeniable. Because that morning at Gate 12, respect hadn't arrived on a stage or with a speech. It had walked in with purpose in the form of Secretary Natalie Brooks. And it had reminded an entire terminal, and perhaps an entire nation, that some people don't demand recognition. They simply deserve it. The applause still echoed faintly in the rafters of Southgate International Airport's Terminal C when Secretary Natalie Brooks and Master Sergeant Thomas Tom Reynolds exited the gate area. But the silence that followed wasn't emptiness, it was reverence. It lingered in the space between breaths, in the glances exchanged by strangers, and in the way every TSA agent suddenly stood a little straighter. Tom's step was still slow, but not because of age. It was deliberate, grounded. The velvet case in his hands, engraved with his name and the word Valor, gleamed faintly in the overhead lights. Behind him, Officer Logan Price remained motionless, the weight of the moment having finally pierced through the cocky armor he had worn at the screening line. His name tag caught the light, but no one was looking at him anymore. They were all watching Tom. The footage began spreading before Tom even boarded the plane. A teenage girl in a denim jacket had captured the entire exchange on her phone. Secretary Brooks's words, the silence, the salute, the escort. She posted it with the caption, "She walked in like thunder." For a man, they tried to ignore. Gotcha, honor Tom. By the time Tom reached Gate 14, it had 2,000 retweets. Within the hour, that number would rise to over 2 million. Onboard Flight 882 to Washington, Tom took his window seat quietly, unaware of the storm building behind him. He set the case in his lap and glanced once at the stewardess, who nodded respectfully. "Take all the time you need, sir," she whispered. He said nothing, but his fingers, rough and scarred, gently stroked the brass plate on the box as if to anchor himself to reality. He hadn't expected any of this, not the humiliation, and certainly not the redemption. Back on the ground, every major news outlet had picked up the story before dinner. CNN ran it as breaking news under the headline, "Veteran Disrespected Honored by Secretary of Defense in Viral Airport Moment." Fox News called it a salute heard across the nation. MSNBC played the full video on loop with a scroll beneath reading simply, "We see you now." Sergeant Reynolds, talk shows picked it up. Veterans across the country shared their own stories under the hashtag #HonorTom. A retired Army nurse described being called Grandma with a badge by airport staff. A Purple Heart recipient posted a picture of his medals, still dented from a past TSA screening. Others uploaded photos of their fathers and grandfathers in uniform writing, "This is for them." By midnight, Chanchar Honor Tom had trended worldwide. At 3:10 a.m., a formal statement from the TSA administrator landed in every major newsroom. "We deeply regret the incident involving Master Sergeant Reynolds at Southgate International Airport. This behavior does not reflect our values, and immediate internal review and retraining procedures are underway. We offer our sincere apology to Mr. Reynolds and to all veterans who deserve our utmost respect. It was corporate, polished, predictable, but that didn't mean it wasn't necessary." The next morning, Tom arrived in Washington, D.C., and was escorted straight from the gate, not by a uniformed detail, but by 3 young Marines in dress blues, all of whom saluted as he stepped off the plane. One of them, a corporal, no older than 22, held the door open and said quietly, "Sir, it's an honor to walk with you." Tom nodded, unsure of what to say. He didn't speak much during the media whirlwind that followed. A morning show anchor tried to push him into a teary interview, but he declined. "I said what I needed to," he told his hotel staff. "The rest belongs to the people now." And indeed, the people responded. At Southgate Airport, a new brass plaque was quietly installed by the TSA checkpoint where it had all begun. It read, "In honor of Master Sergeant Thomas Reynolds, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, United States Marine Corps, disrespected here, then honored as he deserved. Let this never happen again." There was no ribbon cutting, no press, just a small group of veterans and airport staff who stood for a moment in silence. One of them, a janitor in uniform, removed his cap and placed it over his heart. TSA officers were now required to complete a revised training module, respecting military veterans, procedures, and protocols. The footage of Tom's humiliation and Secretary Brooks's words, "You don't touch what you haven't earned," was included as mandatory viewing. Meanwhile, the secretary herself refused interviews. She issued only one statement written in her own hand, posted on the Department of Defense's homepage, "Valor is not a uniform. It's a life lived. It cannot be scanned, x-rayed, or belittled, and when we fail to recognize it, we don't just dishonor one person, we dishonor ourselves." Master Sergeant Thomas Reynolds reminded us what respect looks like. The least we can do is learn. Tom never returned to Southgate Airport, but he didn't need to, because from that day forward, every traveler who walked past that brass plaque and every officer who completed that training would remember the quiet man with the medals in a dented box, and they would remember what happened when the nation finally saw him. The morning sky over Arlington National Cemetery was clear and solemn, the air still with reverence. Rows of white headstones stretched across the green hills, each one a quiet echo of sacrifice. Master Sergeant Thomas "Tom" Reynolds stood beneath the shadow of a memorial arch, the velvet box still cradled in his hands, its brass plate glinting in the rising sun. The crowd gathered in respectful silence, veterans, active duty personnel, families, and a few reporters who kept their distance. This wasn't about spectacle, it was about memory. And Tom, with a voice aged by war and wisdom, spoke just 12 sentences. "I came here today, not to be honored, but to honor. These medals," he said, gently patting the case, "aren't just mine. They belong to every man I left behind and every brother who walked beside me." He paused, glancing out at the stone markers beyond the podium. "We were never promised comfort, only duty, and we gave what we could for as long as we were needed. But this country must remember, service doesn't end with a discharge. It continues through every young soldier who stands watch now. Then without fanfare, Tom turned to a young private at his side, barely 20. Uniform crisp boots, new, and held out the box. "Keep it safe," he said, his voice steady but soft. "You'll need it more than I do." The private, stunned, accepted it with both hands, eyes brimming. "Sir, I don't deserve this." Tom managed a tired smile. "That's what I thought too once." As he stepped back from the podium, no music played, no gun salute, just a simple silence that said more than applause ever could. One by one, those gathered stood a little taller, because what Tom gave that day wasn't a medal, it was a legacy. A reminder that service is not measured by the uniform worn, but by the values carried forward: integrity, courage, quiet strength. Sometimes the most powerful acts of leadership happen not on the battlefield, but in the choice to hand something sacred to the next in line. If this story moved you, type "Service lives on" in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us what honor really looks like, especially when the world forgets to look. Because when we see our veterans clearly, we begin to see ourselves more clearly too.